On June 19, 2024, the iconic Stonehenge monument, estimated to be over 4,500 years old, was defaced by a group of climate protesters on the day before the summer solstice. In a dramatic act of civil disobedience, activists sprayed 3 of the site's standing stones with bright orange paint, sparking outrage among bystanders, some of whom even tried to intervene. The group behind the attack was JustStopOil, an organization that has gained widespread recognition for high-profile attempts to generate publicity for their cause, many of which involve their signature orange paint. But who is JustStopOil? All attempts to learn more about the organization reveal a largely decentralized structure in which nobody seems to be completely in charge. However, recently confirmed rumors now tell us that JustStopOil has actually received millions in funding from a very unlikely source, an heir to one of the biggest oil company fortunes in history. In this video, we'll explore a tangled web that weaves together climate change activists, oil companies, and one of the most notorious and possibly cursed families in history. JustStopOil protests often end in arrests and media condemnation, and the June 19th attack on the Stonehenge monument was no different. Indeed, the activists were quickly arrested by Wiltshire police for vandalism. At first, it seemed that the charges would be severe. Stonehenge is, after all, designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which provides it with some international recognition and protection. Additionally, Stonehenge is managed by English Heritage, a charity that oversees the conservation and public access to the site. In the event of any permanent damage, both of these organizations would be likely to pursue charges to the furthest extent of English law. For the vandals, this would most certainly mean lengthy jail sentences and huge fines. However, as was the case in most previous protests, the orange paint was later determined to be made of a harmless cornflour mixture, one that would simply wash away with the rain. Though some archaeologists expressed concern that there would still be some negative consequences to the lichen that grows on the megaliths, the attack was essentially harmless. This makes sense, as the intent was not to degrade the site, but to interrupt the following day's celebrations. While JustStopOil may be a young organization, it knows exactly what it takes to get attention. On the sunrise of the summer solstice, June 20, the primary axis of Stonehenge is perfectly aligned with the sunrise. Therefore, every year, thousands of pagans, scientists, and tourists flock to the site to witness the event firsthand. The timing of the vandalism would make sure all of these people would get the message, as would anyone watching coverage on the news. But what exactly was the message? Within a few hours of the defacing, JustStopOil had uploaded a video documenting the incident and the subsequent arrest of its activists. Among other things, they claimed that the paint was a statement against the British government's failure to defend communities from climate change. That's one thing that is known about the group. Looking at their website and other media, it's clear that JustStopOil is utterly dedicated to combating human-caused climate change. Since its founding in 2022, the group has continually advocated for the cessation of new fossil fuel licensing and production in the UK. Its efforts have mostly come in the form of civil resistance, non-violent direct action, and, at times, more controversial methods. The Stonehenge fiasco was one of the latter. In addition to advocating for a complete stop to fossil fuel development, exploration, and production, JustStopOil supports investment in renewable energy solutions, as well as improved thermal insulation for buildings, which they hope will aid in conserving energy. Like many modern activist organizations, the group operates in a decentralized, non-hierarchical manner. Members, for lack of a better term, work in autonomous blocks without formal leadership, sharing any and all resources and responsibilities. Like other nonviolent groups, such as Extinction Rebellion and Insulate Britain, JustStopOil has a preference for disrupting cultural institutions, which they see as imperative for drawing attention to their cause. In 2022 alone, JustStopOil carried out several high-profile protests, including blockading the M25 motorway around London and gluing themselves to famous artworks in the National Gallery. Other notable actions include spray painting Shell's headquarters, protesting inside the Science Museum, and throwing soup on Vincent van Gogh's sunflowers at the National Gallery. As with the Stonehenge incident, the artwork was completely unharmed, this time due to it being covered in protective glass. This wasn't an accident either. The activists were well aware of it ahead of time. For all the media rancor surrounding the group, accusations of eco-terrorism, and worse, JustStopOil is not here to destroy, at least not yet. Members are adamant that their provocative actions are only designed to force media coverage and spread their message. So far, it seems to be working. Even pro-traditional energy outlets have hosted debates and discussions about the group's action. Some even agree with the urgency of the climate crisis and the need for immediate action against fossil fuel dependency. However, as with most left-of-center protests, the general belief among conservatives is that there has to be someone with very deep pockets funding these activities. And to a degree, they're right. JustStopOil claims all of their funding comes from donations, but does not disclose who those donations come from. At least, not all of them. But shortly after the group was founded, some news organizations discovered that JustStopOil's primary source of funding is actually the US-based Climate Emergency Fund. To find out just why that's so significant, we have to tell a very different story. One focused on a single family whose wealth is only matched by the amount of tragedy it's experienced. The Gettys. No matter who you are, you're likely familiar with at least one member of the Getty family. Since the middle of the last century, the Gettys have been in the headlines more times than one can count. From business to entertainment to fashion and crime, the Gettys have had their hands in pretty much everything. But this all started with one man, John Paul Getty Sr. An American-born petroleum industrialist, John Paul Getty Sr. founded the Getty Oil Company in 1942. John Paul had been born to a wealthy oil man named George Getty in 1892 and built his fortune in the oil fields of Oklahoma. Despite his own father predicting that he would be the family's ruin, by the mid-1950s, he had become the wealthiest living American. 10 years later, he was listed as the world's richest private citizen by the Guinness Book of World Records. It was clear that John Paul Getty had a knack for business. Throughout his career, he earned a reputation as a shrewd negotiator, lobbying for a 30-year concession in the neutral zone between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and even coming to own a major stake in ESPN. His entire life was about building an empire, one that he would leave to his children, grandchildren, and now great-grandchildren. However, for all his successes, J. Paul Getty would not go down in history for his corporate act. Instead, he would be remembered as one of the most troubling patriarchs in the history of American society. So what was J. Paul Getty's weakness? Money? Power? Drugs? Surprisingly enough, it was frugality. J. Paul Getty was notorious for being extremely cheap. Despite his immense fortune, Getty lived the life of a miser, often withholding funds during times of immense family strain, an act that led many of his children and grandchildren to resent him. To this day, his legacy for penny pinching lives on in both public and private stories from friends, family, and coworkers. They often talked about how he preferred to wash his clothes by hand and simply trim frayed shirt cuffs rather than buying new clothes. This was even after he became one of the world's very first billionaires. Getty also reused stationery around his office. He made a habit of writing replies to letters on the back or in the margins and simply mailing them back to the sender, saving himself from having to purchase a whole new sheet of paper. He also saved and reused things like manila envelopes and rubber bands, things that were even cheaper back in those days than they are today. In time, Getty's commitment to frugality would become the stuff of legend. He famously had a payphone installed in his home, placing dial-locks on all of the standard phones so that his staff, friends, and family members couldn't make long-distance calls on his dime. Once, he took some of his friends to see a show, but found out the tickets became half price after 5 p.m. Immediately, he demanded that he and his group walk around the block several times just to ensure he could lock in that lower price. It all seems like harmless fun until you learn that Getty once criticized his wife for spending too much money on medical treatment for his son, a 12-year-old who had developed a brain tumor. Tragically, the young man first became blind before ultimately succumbing to the disease. Even after hearing of his son's death, Getty had refused to fly home from England for the funeral. His wife divorced him soon after, yet this had little to no effect on Getty's lifestyle. And though he hated spending money with a passion, Getty absolutely loved art. His collection would eventually become the foundation of the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles after he bequeathed more than $661 million of his estate to the site. To this day, the Paul Getty Trust remains the world's wealthiest art institution. He also loved marriage, at least insofar as that he was married and divorced a total of 5 times. Despite this fact, he would only have 5 children, all of whom would go on to inherit vast sums of wealth. Still, if they thought growing up with their father being a penny-pinching billionaire was the end of their problems, they had a lot to learn. In the 1970s, when Getty was nearing the end of his life, he would prove that not even his own family was more important than money. Despite the Getty family's 100-plus years in the spotlight, they are perhaps best known for the high-profile kidnapping of Getty's grandson, John Paul Getty III, in 1973. At just 16 years old, the young man was abducted by members of an Italian crime organization who demanded a $17 million ransom. In today's money, that would be over $120 million. The response from Getty Sr. was less than ideal. At first, Jean-Paul actually accused his grandson, who had a reputation for being a bit rebellious, of staging his own kidnapping to extort money from him. Even after his son, Jean-Paul Jr., convinced him that the kidnapping was real, the elder Getty refused to give up the ransom money, arguing that if he paid, it would only set a precedent, thus putting his 13 other grandchildren at risk. Instead, Jean-Paul Getty did what he had always done. He negotiated, doing whatever he could to bring down the price of the ransom to something he felt was a bit more reasonable. But as the process wore on, the kidnappers got restless. They sent a lock of John Paul III's hair and a portion of his ear to a newspaper, along with a dire warning that the boy would be further mutilated unless the ransom was paid. As family pressure and media scrutiny mounted, J. Paul Getty eventually agreed to pay $2.2 million, which just so happened to be the maximum amount that was tax deductible. He lent the remaining amount to his son with interest. Though the boy was eventually returned alive and the kidnappers apprehended, the bulk of the ransom money was never recovered. Still, the real toll for the ordeal would be paid by his son and grandson. Traumatized by the event, John Paul Getty III descended into drug addiction. In 1981, after a drug overdose, he suffered a debilitating stroke that left him nearly blind and partially paralyzed. He remained in this condition until his death in 2011 at the age of just 54. John Paul Getty Jr., on the other hand, was devastated by his inability to help his son. He too began suffering from addiction problems and had to check himself into a clinic in order to deal with them. Adding to the irony of the situation was the fact that Getty Jr. had actually refused to pay for his son's medical expenses following his stroke, despite earning around $20 million a year from the family's trust. It seemed he had inherited a thing or two from his father after all. John Paul Getty Sr. died in 1973, leaving behind a vast oil fortune to his children and grandchildren. But the tragedies weren't over. In 2020, his grandson, John Gilbert Getty, was found unresponsive in a $1,200 a night suite at the upscale Hotel Emma in San Antonio. Despite concerning evidence, the details of his death were quickly swept under the rug. Both hotel staff and the local police department refused to issue any comment, a tactic many people now recognize as being popular among affluent, high-profile families. It would take several years before a cause of death, a fentanyl overdose, was revealed. Like many of the Getty grandchildren, John Gilbert had taken a more artistic approach in life. He was a talented musician and a major real estate investor, but he also stood to inherit a large portion of the family's $5 billion fortune. Tragically, his death was also preceded by that of his mother and his brother Andrew, who had died after years of methamphetamine abuse 5 years earlier. The point is, by the time John Gilbert's death hit the headlines, having the last name Getty was as much of a curse as it was a blessing. Many members of the younger Getty generation have worked hard to distance themselves from the family's notorious reputation. However, they haven't exactly shied away from the prominence that comes with the name, nor have they shied away from the money. Most of them are undeniably successful in one way or another, and very few have made the decision to stay completely out of the public eye. Ivy Getty is a socialite and artist with a significant Instagram following. Her cousin August Getty is a successful fashion designer who has dressed a growing number of big-name celebrities, including Cher and Lady Gaga. Another cousin, Isabel Getty, is the lead singer of a band based out of the UK. Surprisingly, many of them are not just vocal but prominent supporters of political and social causes that the ultra-conservative elder Gettys would have abhorred. Still, liberalism is not enough to earn them a free pass from a public that is becoming increasingly aware and increasingly angry about oil companies' contributions to climate change. That's where Eileen Getty and JustStopOil come back into the story. Whatever you think of their methods, it's important to remember precisely what activist groups like JustStopOil are actually angry about. After all, From the 1980s to the mid-2000s, oil companies, namely ExxonMobil, were the leading voices in climate change denial. Not only did they deny the existence of man-made climate change, but they also used their considerable funds and influence to oppose any and all regulations aimed at curbing carbon emissions. Among other things, Exxon played a significant role in preventing the ratification of the Kyoto Protocol by the United States, mainly by funding organizations that undermine public trust in the scientific consensus regarding climate change. In a lot of ways, ExxonMobil's tactics mirrored those used by the tobacco industry when it sought to deny the link between lung cancer and cigarettes. Confuse, obfuscate, deny. Like the Koch brothers, whose foundation funds think tanks like the Cato Institute and Americans for Prosperity and media outlets like the Daily Wire, the big oil companies financially supported virtually any person, author, or organization that would deny what their products were doing to the climate. But there was more to it than that. At least in Exxon's case, their internal scientists were actually among the first to discover the link between climate issues and fossil fuel emissions. In fact, senior Exxon scientist James Black reported burning fossil fuels was likely influencing global climate as early as 1977. You might recognize this as the year Star Wars came out. This is decades before most people even heard of the term climate change. But Exxon and other companies not only kept the truth quiet, they purposely went on multi-billion-dollar campaigns to try and prove what they knew was happening wasn't happening. It wasn't until 2014 that the company publicly acknowledged climate change risks. The next year, the company openly expressed support for a carbon tax. But this wasn't enough to save their reputation or let them avoid a lawsuit for misleading investors. But don't worry, ExxonMobil is doing just fine. In 2023 alone, the company boasted a net revenue of $344.6 billion. And while the Getty family actually sold their oil assets to Texaco, which later sold them to Shell, they are nonetheless emblematic of the big oil industry. As artistic and philanthropic as they want to be, the Getty grandchildren and great-grandchildren all enjoy lives of luxury thanks to their family's participation in an industry that has done massive, irreparable damage to the planet. But at least one member of the family is putting her money where her mouth is. In April 2022, it was revealed that JustStopOil's primary funding source was the US-based Climate Emergency Fund, or CEF. While hardly remarkable in and of itself, what is impressive is that this particular organization was co-founded by Eileen Getty, the daughter of John Paul Getty Jr. and brother to John Paul Getty III, the kidnapping victim. Despite her family's deep and often ongoing ties to the oil industry, Eileen has become a major activist, dedicating significant resources to combating climate change. In 2019 alone, the CEF distributed over $4 million to environmental groups. This included Extinction Rebellion and, of course, Just Stop Oil. When Eileen's involvement with Just Stop Oil went public, she not only admitted to the facts, but doubled down. The way she sees it, she is in a unique position to use her family's fortune to bring the very industry that built their wealth to heel. She has publicly and defiantly supported precisely the sort of disruptive climate activism that resulted in Stonehenge being covered in orange paint on June 19th, or that shut down the M25 years earlier. She is a different type of Getty, and, in a lot of ways, a very different type of heiress. Now it seems that some of her other family members may come to stand by her side. Given her grandfather's love of fine art, it seems almost Shakespearean that protesters like Just Stop Oil and Last Generation are gaining more and more notoriety for stunts that take place in art galleries. Eileen is an art lover herself, and putting aside the fact that these protests do nothing to harm the pieces, she feels they are necessary to grow the resistance to fossil fuels. Her CEF has not only provided funds, but also legal and logistical support to activists, helping to foster an entire global network of independent climate protesters. Since the CEF was formed in 2019, it has supported some 94 organizations, trained over 22,000 activists, and mobilized more than 1 million people. None of this would be possible without the big oil money Eileen's grandfather painstakingly saved and stored away. Whether he was negotiating with kidnappers to lower their ransom costs or installing payphones in his own home, J. Paul Getty Sr. personally protected every penny he ever earned. Now, the impact of Eileen Getty's actions remains a subject of intense debate. Some view her efforts as a genuine attempt to address environmental damage, while others see them as controversial or even counterproductive. There are also conspiracy theories suggesting that her connections to big oil might be influencing the movement to give climate activists a bad name. However, these theories are largely based on the contentious nature of her methods and her connections, with no concrete evidence to support them, leaving the interpretation of her contributions and their true motivations up to future generations.